Roy Clark wasn't just a country music legend. He was the joyful soul of Hee Haw, the smiling banjo virtuoso who lit up every stage he touched. But after his death in 2018, something eerie surfaced inside his Tulsa home. While sorting through his belongings, the family came across a locked closet, one Roy had kept sealed for decades. Tucked in the back of his private music room, it had no label, no key in sight, and no explanation. But when they finally opened it, the room fell silent. What lay inside wasn't just personal. It was startling. Letters written to strangers, old military files, unreleased music, and a cryptic voice recording labeled only, "For When I'm Gone." It was as if Roy had been hiding another life, one the world was never meant to see. And what they uncovered inside that closet would leave his family speechless. To millions of Americans, Roy Clark was a household name, a grin that could brighten a room, fingers that danced over strings like magic. Whether he was cracking jokes on Hee Haw or delivering heart-stopping solos on the Grand Ole Opry stage, Roy embodied joy. But beneath the surface, those who knew him best sensed something else, an invisible weight he carried through every performance. Born in Meherrin, Virginia in 1933, Roy was the son of a tobacco farmer and amateur musician. Life was tough, but Roy's love for music made the struggle bearable. By 14, he was mastering the guitar. By 17, he'd won national banjo championships. But even in his earliest days, there were moments where the spark would flicker, where he'd retreat into himself. He once said in an interview, "People think if you smile, you're happy, but some smiles are armor." The man America laughed with on Hee Haw was brilliant. Yes, but also haunted. As his career skyrocketed, so did the expectations. His schedule was brutal. Appearances, tours, TV shoots. Even when he was sick or grieving, the show had to go on. He rarely said no. He didn't know how. Friends described a Roy who gave everything to the stage, but very little to himself. And at home, there was a growing tension. He was warm, generous, but guarded. There were rooms in his house even his children didn't enter, closets that stayed locked. And when asked about them, Roy would chuckle, deflect, maybe tell a joke about secret stashes of banjos. But the joke was always a wall, a way to steer attention away. One closet in particular stood out. It was always there, quiet, untouched. Roy told Barbara, his wife of over 6 decades, never to open it. She assumed it held old contracts or fragile instruments, nothing more. But Roy had a habit of burying his truths in melody. His fingers would reveal what his voice never dared. That's why his unreleased music, what the family found later, was so jarring. It was Roy without the armor. And when the family finally opened that closet after his passing, they weren't just entering a room, they were stepping into a secret chapter of Roy's life, one written in silence, guarded by guilt, and layered beneath decades of public applause. The world thought they knew Roy Clark, but the contents of that closet would reveal the man no one ever truly saw. It wasn't just a storage space, it was a vault. Tucked away in the far corner of Roy Clark's music room, behind amplifiers and faded awards, was a narrow door most visitors never noticed. No one remembered seeing it open, not once. His children said it was always off limits. Even Barbara, his wife of 61 years, had never seen inside. When she asked about it, Roy would just smile and say, "That's where the ghosts live." And then he'd move on, strumming his banjo, shifting the energy, hiding something. After Roy's death in 2018, the family finally decided to unlock it. They searched drawers, filing cabinets, every jacket pocket, until they found an old brass key tucked inside a guitar case lined with red velvet. It fit, and what they found inside wasn't a cluttered mess. It was deliberate, organized, preserved. Stacked cardboard boxes labeled in Roy's handwriting, a sealed black case, reels of magnetic tape, dozens of manila envelopes, many tied with string. Everything inside looked untouched for years, but behind the shelves, something strange caught their attention. The back panel of the closet had a subtle line, an outline. When they pushed against it, it gave way with a soft creak. A hidden compartment. Inside, a smaller box. Locked. This one had no key. They forced it open. Inside were photos no one had ever seen. Roy standing beside a military aircraft. Roy shaking hands with a man in uniform. Roy looking solemn, dressed in clothes from decades before. These weren't showbiz pictures, these were personal, government issue. And then there was a sealed letter marked, "For my family, only when I'm gone." The handwriting was shaky, different, older. Inside the envelope was a single cassette labeled "Play Alone." The room went still. They didn't know whether to cry or be afraid. The Roy Clark they had known, funny, generous, cheerful, suddenly felt like a puzzle missing half its pieces. The closet hadn't just held memorabilia. It held a secret history, a hidden Roy, the kind of man who carried burdens in silence, the kind of man who used laughter to cover scars. And now, for the first time, his family was beginning to see just how deep those scars ran. The closet had waited patiently for decades, and now that it was open, there was no going back. They waited until the house was empty. The family gathered in the quiet of Roy's music room, holding the cassette like it was made of glass. A tape player was found, one of Roy's old reel-to-reel decks, still plugged in beneath a dusty shelf. They inserted the cassette, hit play, and for a few seconds, nothing. Then came the crackle of static, and finally, a voice, tired, aged, and unmistakably Roy Clark. "If you're hearing this," he said, "then I'm already gone, and there's something I need to say, something I never could when I was alive." The room froze. It wasn't a performance. It was a confession. Roy spoke slowly, deliberately. He talked about the cost of fame, the friendships that dissolved in silence, and a part of his life he had locked away, literally and emotionally. "There's a name you won't recognize, Ellie," he said. "She helped me through things I couldn't tell anyone. When the lights went off and the crowd was gone, Ellie was the only voice I trusted." He didn't explain who she was, only that she knew everything. Roy went on to talk about a tragedy in his past, a night that changed him forever. "I made a choice," he said, "and someone else paid for it." His voice cracked. He paused. "Music was how I survived. Not applause, not the jokes, just music." The tape continued for 25 minutes. He didn't cry, he didn't ask for forgiveness, but he admitted that the closet was his way of remembering the things the world didn't want to see. "They only ever wanted the smiles," he said, "and I gave them what they asked for, but inside, I was someone else entirely." He ended the recording with a soft whisper. "Maybe now you'll understand why I kept that door closed. It wasn't about shame, it was about survival." The tape clicked to a stop. No one moved. For a moment, it felt like Roy was still there in the room, sitting beside them, peeling back the curtain he'd spent a lifetime keeping drawn. The tape wasn't for fans, it wasn't for legacy, it was for truth, raw, vulnerable, undeniable, and it shattered the image they thought they knew. Roy Clark hadn't just hidden memories behind a locked door, he had buried a second self. And now, with his voice echoing through the silence, that second self had finally come to life. Beneath the tapes and folders lay a small wooden chest, unlocked but weathered with age. Inside were dozens of letters, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. Some were written on torn notebook paper, others on fine stationery. The name that kept appearing was Ellie. No last name, no return address, just Ellie. Some letters were addressed to Roy, others were clearly written by him, dated as far back as the 1960s. They weren't romantic, they weren't business, they were something else, intimate but guarded, like two people talking in a secret code. In one letter, Ellie wrote, "You were right not to tell them. The world wouldn't understand, and the stage would have never forgiven you." Another read, "Don't carry this alone. It wasn't your fault. We did what we thought was right." The handwriting changed over the years, but the tone remained the same, haunted, reflective, burdened. Roy's replies were filled with guilt and longing. "I've built a life out of laughter, but inside, it still echoes." He wrote in one letter, "I still hear the tires. I still see his face." That line sent chills down Barbara's spine. She knew nothing of an accident. Who was he? And what did Roy mean by "still hear the tires"? They searched the closet again and found more. Hidden behind the lining of a guitar case was a smaller envelope, sealed with wax. Inside was a black and white photo of a teenage boy holding a mandolin, with Roy's unmistakable handwriting on the back. "If only I had driven." Beneath it, another letter from Ellie. "He looked up to you. He forgave you. Why can't you forgive yourself? The picture, the letters, the cryptic references, it all pointed to a tragedy Roy had kept buried deep. A young life lost, a guilt never processed. Ellie, whoever she was, had been Roy's lifeline in the shadows, a confidant he never introduced, never mentioned, but poured his soul into through ink and paper. These weren't fan letters, they were lifelines, and they revealed a Roy Clark who bled quietly behind the curtain of fame. The family realized they weren't just discovering secrets, they were inheriting grief, the kind of grief that had shaped the music, the performances, the man himself. Every laugh, every song, every show now carried a new weight. And as they read the final letter in the stack, dated just months before Roy's death, it ended with a single line. I hope they find this someday. Maybe then they'll finally know who you really were. In the far corner of the closet sat a locked black case, its leather scuffed, the brass latches stiff with time. Inside were reel-to-reel tapes, pristine, labeled only with cryptic titles like The Other Side, Wrong Stage, and one simply marked Midnight. These weren't concert recordings or studio masters, they were raw, intimate sessions. Just Roy, a guitar, and the kind of silence you only hear when a man is completely alone. The first tape began with the sound of a chair creaking, followed by a long exhale. Then his voice, softer than anyone had ever heard it. He sang slowly, painfully, like the words were too heavy to carry. I played the fool on the screen, he whispered between verses, but the tears were always mine. The lyrics weren't clever or polished. They were confessions set to melody. One song detailed a lonely drive through Tennessee, headlights slicing through rain, a crash never mentioned by name, but unmistakable in its imagery. Another song, Shadow in the Mirror, described a man who couldn't look himself in the eye. Roy sang, Every laugh I gave them stole a piece of me. These weren't meant for release. There were no overdubs, no harmonies, no banjo tricks, just voice and truth. The family listened in stunned silence as track after track unraveled decades of pain, regret, and longing. Even more shocking, some of the recordings were dated during years when Roy had been at his public peak. Tours, awards, TV specials, to the world, he was thriving. But in these tapes, he was unraveling. One song ended with him saying, No one will hear this, but I had to get it out, or I'd drown. The most haunting tape was the last. Roy spoke directly into the microphone, not singing. I kept these locked away because I didn't want to tarnish what people loved. They wanted the banjo, the smiles, but this is the man behind all that. Then, silence. Not static, just nothing. The kind of nothing that fills a room louder than sound. These weren't outtakes, they were therapy. A mirror into the parts of Roy Clark that the spotlight never touched. And now, long after the applause had faded, his family held in their hands the music he never wanted anyone to hear, but maybe needed someone to. Beneath the final row of boxes, hidden beneath a sheet of velvet cloth, was a military briefcase. It was worn, dented, and cold to the touch. The family had no idea Roy Clark ever served in the military. It wasn't in any biography, not in interviews, not in liner notes. But inside that case was a story Roy had never told, at least not publicly. The documents were stamped United States Air Force, his name, his ID number, a photograph of Roy, barely in his 20s, standing beside a C-47 transport plane, guitar slung over one shoulder, a grim expression on his face. There was a mission log, handwritten in Roy's careful script. Locations, Korea, Japan, Guam. The dates matched the early 1950s. What was Roy doing overseas during the Korean War? He wasn't a fighter. He wasn't listed as a soldier. He was part of a classified morale unit, assigned to play music for troops stationed near active combat zones. But the deeper they looked, the stranger it got. Several mission logs were redacted. Others referenced transport flights that never appeared in official records. One entry read, "Dropped near base perimeter. Played set under blackout conditions. Enemy fire audible from East Ridge." This wasn't just entertainment. Roy had been flown into dangerous, even volatile situations, and in one chilling note he wrote, "Music kept them alive for one more night." That's what they told me, but I don't think I've ever come back from that place. Barbara had never heard a word of this. Not a memory, not a passing comment. He'd buried it so deep, she suspected even he tried to forget. Among the files was a folded American flag and a list of names. Handwritten, soldiers, fellow musicians. One name was circled, Ellis Raymond. Next to it, gone. He shouldn't have been on that flight. A gut punch. Was this the man in the photograph from the earlier letter? Was this the person Roy had blamed himself for losing? It would explain everything. The guilt, the silence, the songs that spoke of crashes and shadows. Roy had carried not only the weight of fame, but also the ghosts of a war no one knew he'd seen. These weren't just secrets. They were wounds, invisible to the world, but now finally exposed. And they painted a portrait of Roy Clark not as a legend, but as a man who had seen too much, lost too much, and somehow turned that pain into joy for millions, while never letting go of the darkness inside. At the bottom of the closet, behind the military case and tucked beneath layers of cloth, was one final envelope, yellowed, crumpled, sealed only with tape. It wasn't labeled like the others. No, play me or read this when I'm gone. It simply said one word, forgive. Barbara held it in her hands for a long time before opening it. Inside was a newspaper clipping, dated 1968. A two-car crash on a wet Tennessee road. One dead, one injured. The victim, Ellis Raymond, age 23, an up-and-coming mandolin player from Nashville. The surviving driver was never named, but Roy's handwriting was scrawled in the margin. I should have been the one driving. Next to it, a folded note, faded, trembling words. We had just finished the set. He said he was too tired, but I insisted we drive home. I let him take the wheel because I thought I'd close my eyes for 5 minutes. I woke up in the hospital. He never woke up at all. The breath left Barbara's lungs. She had never heard of Ellis Raymond, never knew Roy had played with him, never saw a photo. But the regret poured off the page like it had been written yesterday. Roy had never been charged. No foul play had been suspected. It was ruled an accident, but the guilt, he had never escaped it. The letters to Ellie made more sense now. She must have been connected to Ellis. A sister? A fiancé? The silent recipient of Roy's lifelong confessions. In one letter, Roy had written, "Every time I hear an ovation, I see the crash. Every laugh is an echo of what I stole. I lived, and he didn't, and I still don't know why." The music, the military tours, the hidden songs, all of it suddenly aligned. Roy Clark had spent his entire life smiling for the world, but mourning in private, carrying a death he felt responsible for, bearing the weight of survival. That night, the family sat together in silence. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if Roy was in the room with them again. Not the entertainer, but the man. The one who made people laugh to keep himself from breaking. The one who gave the world joy while carrying unspeakable sorrow. The one who never asked to be forgiven, but clearly, so desperately, needed to be. What they found in that envelope wasn't just a story. It was the missing piece of his soul, and it changed everything they thought they knew about Roy Clark. When the last box was emptied and the final letter read, Roy Clark's family stood in a different house than the one they had known. The walls were the same, the furniture untouched, but the man they thought they knew had transformed. To the world, Roy Clark was a legend, a country music superstar, the face of Hee Haw, a gifted musician who could make a banjo sing and an audience roar with laughter. But beyond the spotlight, behind every joke and every standing ovation, was a man quietly unraveling. The closet had been more than storage. It was his sanctuary, his graveyard of memory, his personal confessional. Each item they found was a thread, and when pulled together, they formed a tapestry of truth that had been woven behind locked doors for decades. A hidden military past that placed him on the edge of combat zones, where music wasn't just entertainment, but a lifeline, a friendship, maybe even a brotherhood, cut short by tragedy, and a moment of sleep behind the wheel that haunted him until his last breath. A mysterious woman named Ellie, who became his silent partner in grief, offering Roy a place to unload the pain he couldn't speak aloud. And songs, heartbreaking songs, ones never meant for radio or stage. Songs where Roy poured the pieces of himself he couldn't show the public. Songs that bled. The family listened to them differently now. Every strum, every lyric, suddenly alive with deeper meaning. His laughter wasn't just humor, it was armor. His charm wasn't just natural, it was survival. And Hee Haw, for all its silliness, may have been the greatest performance of all. Because while the world laughed along, Roy was quietly keeping the ghosts at bay. The truth didn't destroy their love for him, it deepened it. He wasn't just a star. He was a man who had endured war, tragedy, guilt, and the suffocating weight of silence. And yet, he gave the world beauty. He gave them laughter. He gave them music. That's the part that still makes his story miraculous. He could have collapsed under it all. He could have disappeared into his own sorrow. But instead, he rose every day, picked up his guitar, and chose to give joy to others. That kind of strength doesn't come from talent. It comes from pain, real pain. And now, after discovering everything that closet held, Roy's family finally saw the full man. Not just the performer, not just the icon, but the human being who spent a lifetime smiling through the weight of the unspeakable. They decided to leave the closet door open, not as a shrine, not as a spectacle, but as a symbol, a reminder that behind every great man, every showbiz legend, there might be a story no one ever sees, a burden no one ever suspects. And sometimes, the real performance isn't what's on the stage, it's what's kept hidden when the curtain falls. Roy Clark didn't leave behind just a legacy of music. He left behind a final act, a whispered truth stored in a closet, waiting for the right moment to be heard. And now that it has, it changes everything.